You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Travel smarter, not harder, at America's Best Value Inn by Sonesta, with convenient locations from coast to coast and value-packed comfort at every turn. And when you're a Sonesta Travel Pass member, staying at America's Best Value Inn means earning points toward free nights, upgrades, and more. Go to Sonesta.com to book your stay and unlock their best rates with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at Sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.
Good morning, everybody. Corey used Bloody History. So we're going to pick right up with the Richard Sprague, Jim Garrison conference document. One of the better documents I've found in the past couple of years. They were talking about sightings of Oswald in Mexico in 62 and 63, which honestly don't make sense to me. I mean, it's possible he went there. I don't understand why he would go there. It makes more sense. It was Kerry Thornley going to Mexico City, claiming to be Oswald. Right? And we have multiple documented incidents of Kerry Thornley going to Mexico City in 63, right? In May and in September. Twice in September, if you count the time he impersonated Oswald. But, all right, so let's pick up here. Yes, I think he mentioned seeing Oswald in Mexico City, and he said something about a woman being with him. That figures. Garrison says, but you could not get him to be more specific than that. Then he'd go ice skating away. Boxley says, Martin was an investigator for Maurice Brooks Gatling. Who was? William S. Martin. Your former employee, Jim. Apparently, he's talking about the same William Martin we sent to see him. Right. That may be why we were never able to get any specifics. Oh, Jesus. That is right. Boxley says he was in 60 and 61 chief investigator for Maurice Brooks Gatling. He smelled Martin. Yeah, either that or he knew of his prior connections. Garrison says Martin said the wrong thing. Boxley responds, Gatling was sending people, as were your men. He was sending people to Guy Bannister, and so he and Bannister were working hand in hand. And it's quite probably that when Nagel saw Bill Martin, his office used to be in the Trade Mart. Yeah, he put him with Maurice Brooks Gatling. Incidentally, Gatling was killed in San Juan, Puerto Rico, not Panama. He was? Right, how do you know that? On May 31st, I found a clipping in it. The Times-Picayune the other day, May 31st of 60. No, wait a minute. That's the date of the article, so he would have died the 29th or 30th, 65. Anything different as to the circumstances? No, 6th floor balcony. Found at the bottom, and the paper here got its information from his son, M.B. Gatling Jr. And Jr. said that, according to the coroner's report, he actually died from a heart attack, suffered from the fall. A six-story fall. Yes, it can. Also head injuries, and everyone laughs. Apparently, there's some insurance involved or something. There's one other strange death that's come up recently. You may have heard, and that's Damon Runyon Jr. Oh, yes, that's true, because he was really digging into it. And when he came to see us, he was surprised. And then it cuts off, and it says end of tape, and then it goes to the next side. I think it picks up in a different conversation, but you never know. And then this starts with someone asking, the Wall Street Journal? No, this little 4-page, the Washington Observer. The Washington Observer is O. Roy Chalk's paper in Washington, but he had been a newsman for about 20 years previous to that end. It may have been a genuine suicide. He had all sorts of family troubles and other things, but on the other hand, it's quite strange coincidence again. You can't find any of this stuff. Uh-huh. How safe is Nagel now in Switzerland? Who says he's in Switzerland? Garrison says, I think he's in Russia. Fensterwald says, I think he's behind the Iron Curtain. Garrison says, I think he's behind the curtain, which is certainly safer than here. I think there's nothing more we're going to find out from or about him. I'm afraid we've burned ourselves with him, Martin. Now that's incredible. Bill, in other words, Nigel told you about William Martin. How did Martin come into it with Nigel? He went to prison. He went to visit him in prison. And at one juncture, Nigel saw him being buddy-buddy with the warden or doctor or somebody, and he clammed up just like that. But Greenstein is still around, and he was in Mexico. Boxley says, either that or Nigel is just filling everybody full of smirch. No, Nigel is not, it's not in his personality. He has no tendency to exaggerate. His words are very carefully considered. He cased something about Martin or overheard him saying the wrong thing, or Martin asked the wrong questions. He saw him talking to the wrong people. That was it, but Martin came back and gave us the explanation, saying all he was doing was inquiring about his health or something. Was Bill Martin a former investigator for Gatlin? Yeah. Boxley says he apparently got cold feet when the Bureau shook him down. I saw a letter of his to Gatlin saying that the Bureau had questioned him and they were going to hang him in Gatlin on failure to register as foreign agents in representing Nicaragua in a deal. And then there's a 2-page long explanatory letter, very gratuitous, from Gatlin back to Martin explaining that they were certainly pro-American and that it's an interesting letter because it looks like an intelligence operation apart from the Bureau and the CIA. That was in Bannister's files, wasn't it? Yeah. Anybody know anything, speaking of Bannister's files, about a letter of Mark, M-A-R-Q-U-E, from Bobby Kennedy on this Houma, Louisiana raid? No. When Bannister and Norvell and others were going to take ammunition from a dump over in Houma, Bannister apparently got a letter from the Justice Department, which in effect was a letter of Mark. I think, I don't know what that means. I never heard of that before. I think we've got to attribute that to Leighton Martins. It doesn't seem to develop outside of Martins. Interesting they're bringing Martins into this. Well, they are talking about the Houma raid. Novell claims to have had a copy of the thing because when Novell refused to go on the raid unless he was given immunity from prosecution if they got caught. So that's apparently where the letter is in existence today. But there are 2 or 3 other copies of it floating around. Ooh, that's interesting. So Gordon Novell went on the Houma, Louisiana raid with Dave Ferrie, Leighton Martin, Sergio Arcacha, couple other guys. Louis Rebel. And Novell told Garrison that the CIA left the door open for him. And here, now, Garrison is letting on that he wasn't going to do the raid, that Novell said he wasn't going to do the raid unless he got immunity from prosecution if they got caught. That's fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. Well, wasn't some of that arms destined for the OAS? Well, that ties in with Gatlin. Ooh, the OAS. I mean, are they talking about France? Didn't I have specifics on the boxes of the walls? What did they have inside of them? These were Schlumberger. Schlumberger, which is a Dutch outfit. Well, that's not really that true. Schlumberger is Jean de Menil's company. And there we go. They're about to talk about them. And which de Menil has close ties with. I thought it was French. See, now they're getting into Permindex and stuff. It is French, not Dutch. No, their headquarters are in Paris. Because, see, Schlumberger was his wife's name. What was her name? Renee Schlumberger, I believe, or something like that. And he married into that family. And then he ends up taking over that company at some point, the Schlumberger company. So, perhaps it is French. But run out of Houston. These munitions were destined for the secret army, the OAS. Destined for the right-wing OAS. Didn't they have a name for it or something? How do we know they were destined for the French? It was the labeling on the crate. It said something about going to France. Something like that. It seemed to me that Hugh Ward is from... See, now this is phonetic spelling, so I don't know what they're really talking about. Didn't Hugh Ward come from Newborough? But I don't think that's... Newborough. It must be Newborough. It came from people we questioned who were on the... I can't think of it. They saw the writing on the crates. Pictures of a lot of crates like that. Jerry Milton Brooks, he sort of hung around Gatlin's office as well, working for Bannister. Well, he said this, that at one point Gatlin had a little, something is redacted here, apparently. He sort of took Jerry under his wing as a prospective protege and said, I can get you a license to kill. He said Gatlin traveled all over the place. And he said one time he was talking and he said something about he had a pile of money. And he says, $100,000 is going to the OAS and going to Paris. It's for the secret army. And he said, God damn, if he didn't go to Paris. He took off. Boxley says, don't forget, too, that the private Eugene Dinkins bit, what's the operation that handles CIA code, wireless interruption coding and that? National Security Agency. That was an interesting description. That's why I paused. Don't forget, too, that the private Eugene Dinkins bit, what's the operation that handles CIA code, wireless interruption coding and that? National Security Agency. That's an interesting take on it. He was a cipher clerk for the NSA. Dinkin was? Dinkin was. Now, this is the guy who's supposed to be nuts, and if you go see him today in Brooklyn, like I did 3 months ago, he will convince you he's a flat nut. But he was a cipher clerk for the NSA when he was picked up ahead of the assassination, put in a base hospital for a week, and flown to Walter Reed. And the operation was connected through an MP outfit, which was essentially S operations, indicating, I think, that the CIA had a hand in the. His documents, incidentally, are not classified FBI in the archives. They are classified CIA. What is CIA doing classifying? Let me add a footnote. Well, how did he know Oswald? He interrupted some traffic. That's what happened. He read some code going back and forth on the OAS operation, apparently, that tipped him to what was going down here out of New Orleans. And they just stuck him in the funny house. Okay, so let me just give you the last couple pages. It took me a little bit to comprehend what's going on here.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Sonesta Travel Pass is the most rewarding way to travel. Sign up at sonesta.com for instant savings, bonus points, and perks like early check-in and late checkout, room upgrades, and free stays. Choose from 1,100 hotels across 13 brands and unlock their best rates when you book with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at sonesta.com. That's sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.
But apparently, Eugene Dinkin, or Dinkins, as I've seen it before, I'm not sure which it is, he intercepted some code working for the NSA that involves operations in New Orleans. And we've already just read that these operations in New Orleans, via Schlumberger, run by Jean DeMille, who sat on the board of Permindex, these guys had a direct connection to the OAS. And that's where you get into the Corsicans and Jean-Pierre Lafitte, who lived in New Orleans for quite some time, who was actually going by the name Gene Martin, working at the Pimsall Club. The Pimsall Club was, if I'm not mistaken, inside the Trade Mart. Jean-Pierre Lafitte, man, what a master of what he did. Because he's so in the background. He managed to stay out of everything and be involved in everything. You never see anything written about the guy, barely. It's wild stuff. But yeah, so now we have, not only do we have the standard connections to Permindex and the OAS, that direction, but now we have the connection directly from New Orleans to Permindex. All right, so let me get back to this document. Well, wasn't some of that arms destined for the OAS? Well, that ties in with Gatlin. Didn't I have specifics on the boxes on the walls? What did they have inside those? Were Schlumberger. Schlumberger is a Dutch outfit. And and which de Mohrenschildt has close ties with. I thought it was French. It's French, not Dutch. No, their headquarters are in Paris. Okay, so now we have a connection to George de Mohrenschildt and Schlumberger, which obviously would have been through Jean de Menil. No, their headquarters are in Paris. These munitions were destined for a secret army, OAS, destined for the right wing, OAS. Didn't they have a name for it or something? How do we know they were destined for the French? It was on the labeling on the crate. This is all fascinating stuff, is why I'm going over it again. We really need to come to grips with the fact that New Orleans was much closer connected to these international elements than we've actually seen before. Jerry Milton Brooks, that's a name we've come across again also. Several times. I think Jerry Milton Brooks was connected with McIntyre and with Warren Reynolds and Lauren Hall out in these California right-wing movement stuff that also Kerry Thornley got involved with too. So, God, it's just amazing when you really start to dig into these obscure documents, how you can hear that you won't find in any other document, but you'll find in the conversations, but that Garrison had, that you start to see these overarching relationships here. You start to see everybody's connected, all the right-wingers and the CIA and the French. It's wild stuff. All right, so back to Dinkin. His documents, incidentally, are not classified FBI in the archives. They're classified CIA. What is CIA doing classifying? Let me add a footnote. Well, how did he know Oswald? He interrupted some traffic. That's what happened. He read some code going back and forth on the OAS, apparently, and that tipped him to what was going on down here in New Orleans. And they just stuck him in the funny house. I'll give you a footnote because we got a letter from a friend of his who was in his company, and it was apparently genuine since it hardly served the government's purpose. It says that he recalled, he read my Playboy interview where I mentioned Private Dinkins. In other words, I brought up the point of how curious it was that here the U.S. government had to keep hidden allegations of Private First Class Dinkins, and he, as he said, in effect, you might be curious as to what his allegations were. Dinkins was convinced that President Kennedy was going to be assassinated by a combination of the military and the right wing, and was very strong about making comments to that extent. As a result, he then says, the Army took him to the psychiatrist, and he was shipped to Walter Reed, and that's, in other words, he had stumbled onto something somewhere. How long did they keep him locked up? Apparently, until he memorized his cover story, a matter of several months, but he took polygraph examination, and that's extremely interesting when he got out. The polygraph proves, or would tend to prove, that what he said in the beginning was true. Now, he came under top-level Justice Department supervision at Walter Reed. I've got these names and these notes. He was an exposure point. Now, his cover story is this. He's got it down pat. He will pull out all these clippings from Stars and Stripes and Overseas Weekly and so on, dated back in those days, and he'll refer to typographical errors that he's got underlined. Now, this is how I got onto him. He says, see here, a kidney operation, but they don't spell it kidney. They spell it kidney with an N-E-Y. It's a typographical error. He'll say, you see, that means Kenneth. That means really Kenneth. Well, it's even farther out and more of a nut approach than ESP or something, but they don't put guys like this in the NSA to begin with. No, those guys are really screened. Okay, so what is he saying here? This could be really important because remember, in Oswald's letters and all kinds of stuff, he's got misspellings, a lot of misspellings, and people are like, well, he's a bad speller, but maybe not. Listen, let me reread this again. Now, his cover story is this, and he's got it down pat. He will pull out all these clippings from Stars and Stripes and Overseas Weekly and so on, dated back in those days, and he'll refer to typographical errors that he's got underlined. Now, this is how I got onto him. He says, see here, here's a kidney operation, but they don't spell it kidney. They spell it okay, I said that wrong earlier. It's kidney operations, but they don't spell it kidney. They spell it kindney, Kindney. It's a typographical error. He'll say, you see, that really means Kenneth. Kidney. Well, it's even farther out and more of a nut approach than ESP or something, but they don't put guys like that in the NSA to begin with. Okay, so this is very important, this one sentence right here, because what he's saying is that Dinkins tried to explain to him that misspellings that were in the papers, and Stars and Stripes and Overseas. Stars and Stripes was the Marine, if I'm not mistaken, it was the Marine newspaper. And Overseas Weekly, these were military papers. So he's saying that misspellings are not really misspellings. Misspellings are sending messages. And that's possibly what Oswald did. Like, with the biggest one that sticks out in my mind is his brother lived on Davenport, Davenport. But he repeatedly mailed him and had written in his book Davenport, Davanport. Is that just a misspelling? There's a lot of that in Oswald's writings. A lot of weird misspellings. Even the borderline cases don't go in. You don't get in the NSA unless you're, can you tell Bud how you located him? Maybe another approach might. I'll have to look it up in my notes in the car, but I've got his address in Brooklyn where he was living. He may have moved. What's he doing for a living now? He's in the Manhattan phone book, but the address is not right. He doesn't have to do anything. Does he work? Yeah, this is interesting. He's supposed to be a mental therapist at a hospital in Brooklyn. He has about 10 dogs in his apartment. There's a colonel in Albuquerque that knows this whole story and would be approached. Oh, really? That's interesting. Yeah, I've got his name and address too, which I will dig out for you. Do you think you'll be in Monday? I'll dig up the letter. I'll be here Monday and Tuesday. Remind us to get the letter from you, from the guy who was in the service with him. I think this is genuine because we've got this at a time when we were unaware of the military aspect. The right wing, yes. But the military, no. It's kind of hard to swallow. Let me ask you, Jim, sometime between now and the time I leave, could I have about 30 minutes with you on what the Justice Department has done specifically to bog down your... The reason I ask this is because I'm in the process of putting together a book on what a dirty bastard the federal government can be if you cross them, and you're one chapter in it. Garrison says it'll take more than 30 minutes, though. Well, I would at least like to get it straight from the horse's mouth rather than from going around the barn. He's got a petition there to have the HUAC, that's the House Un-American Affairs Committee, investigate Martin Luther King. Beanie is the right preacher, independent Baptist in St. Louis. Go back over some of the old papers and find out that when Ray and a guy by the name of Owens pulled this Kroger supermarket stick up in 1960, he went to the joint. What's Owens' first name? This is Bill Beatty. James Owens, I think. This is James Earl Ray. Doesn't that look like him? Is that what you were going to say? No, I wasn't going to say that. Here's a side view of him. No resemblance there. But the front view sure looks like him. But get this. Owens gave an address at that time of such and such a number on Olive Street. The number on Olive Street was the old St. Louis Rescue Mission. Who the hell ran the St. Louis Rescue Mission? Bill Beanie and I understand from a guy in St. Louis. There was a lot of hoods, that they picked up guys for any kind of jobs down there. One thing about St. Louis that kind of strikes me is that Marilyn Moret went and lived in St. Louis after she left New Orleans for a while.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forests, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Sonesta Travel Pass is the most rewarding way to travel. Sign up at sonesta.com for instant savings, bonus points, and perks like early check-in and late checkout, room upgrades, and free stays. Choose from 1,100 hotels across 13 brands and unlock their best rates when you book with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at sonesta.com. That's sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.
I wonder if there's a connection there somehow. Garrison says, sure, it looks like him, doesn't it? Just think, James Earl Ray almost became lieutenant governor. It does look close, doesn't it? think the course of history would have changed if he was elected lieutenant governor, and everyone laughs. This is the late James Earl Ray, the latest one. Not like any of these. Honestly, that sure looks like him, though. The mouth and the eyes. Look at the hair, the widow's peak. We've got some interesting things to go through that you all haven't even heard of yet. We've been digging into the death of Robert Perrin. Garrison says, I don't think I have to make that point with any of you, just as Curry was. They probably had machinery set up that any of the key people arrested were brought straight to Fritz. They've got to keep control of the situation. That's interesting. I never thought about that. Anybody who got arrested who was important were brought straight to Fritz. There's another thought on this Braden change of name that you might consider now that I see his physical description. He's almost a ringer for Tom Braden, CIA man. Now, if he changed his name to Jim Braden in September of 63, maybe the idea was to implicate Tom Braden, because Tom, I think, is 6'3", and Jim Braden is 6'2". Bill Willie would not have made any move consciously to implicate the federal government or former members. Everything that we've encountered for 18 months has been to point away from it. Boxley says, that's right, but we don't know what their plans were in September of 63. What made you think Braden might be Bradley? Well, Gene Braden and Gene Bradley. Too bad you can't find Jim Braden. He gave a phony address, it says here. He gave a business address in La Ciant. I can't read that, it's phonetic. And there was no 100 block like that. So I went to the apartment houses about a year ago in West LA. You know, it was one of these big apartment houses that people move in like musical chairs. And the woman there says, I've only been the manager since now I can't remember. I just ran against a stone wall there. It's almost identical physical description with Tom Braden. Same height, same age, same weight. Who was he? Well, Tom Braden's the publisher of the Oceanside paper. He's very active with Bobby Kennedy, an ex-OAS CIA type. This is what the article in the Post was. I'm glad the CIA is moral. He's a prototype of the CIA executive. He belongs to the liberal establishment. Like, it's funny, they were talking about the liberal establishment back in 68. He belongs to the liberal establishment, like Arthur Sylvester. It took me a long time to realize, but the reason we don't have any liberal help in this thing is because something has happened to them. First of all, the Vietnam War is really their war, and the CIA is their intelligence agency. In other words, this is what started off nobly enough in World War II. It's like an organism which was originally benevolent and something happened to him. It deals in corruption and became corrupt. Ooh, that is wild. That is wild. I got to screenshot that for posterity. All right, continuing on, Garrison then says, when I said earlier there was an economic aspect, I should have qualified it. There's an economic aspect of the assassination looking at the defense industries, but from the point of view of the structure concerned, the subject is power. And what you're dealing with here, I think, is a very cool project to develop a Pax Americana. And that's why you have things like France coming in and you have the Asian aspect. Here's the reasons the Cubans were selected. I think this thing has to be regarded as carefully as planned Normandy invasion and the development of it. In other words, anybody digging behind the surface for a year, all they encounter is Cubans. The real subject is Vietnam and Asia, and I think that is one of the distractions that they have built into it. Why they developed the Cuban aspect. It's an arrow pointing over that way rather than over here. Oh my God, I fucking love Jim Garrison. He just nailed everything that I've been saying about the Cubans forever. The Cubans are a fucking red herring. When they developed the Cuban aspect, it's an arrow pointing over that way rather than over here. That's the concern. They even have their own companies. They're smuggling opium. They want a continued war in Asia at all costs. Question of survival. So what do you see? Cuba, Cuba, Cuba. Oh my God, Jim Garrison had this all figured out back in 68. He hasn't connected Israel to it yet, but he will. I'll tell you what, if you've got a few minutes at this point, I think it will really help illuminate what they've done. This has to be kept in mind all the way through because there's a great danger after you encounter this individual here. Let's say Gatlin and this one here, Ferrie, and this one Bannister. And I think there's a great danger of seeing a collection of seedy individuals and the picture gets confusing. They've been pushed up to the front. That's all you're allowed to see. But what is the force behind? To find out the force behind, the best way to do it, since it's keeping itself submerged, is to see who's rewarding potential witnesses, and who other individuals were beforehand. In other words, forget November 22nd. Let's go beforehand and afterwards. Alfred Claude, who hired Oswald at the Riley Coffee Company, now works for Chrysler Aerospace Division. Emmett Barbie, Oswald's immediate supervisor at Riley Coffee Company, hired by the U.S. NASA facility at New Orleans, manufactures Saturn rockets. John DeBranian worked with Oswald at the Riley Coffee Company and now works at Boeing Aircraft in New Orleans. In other words, never mind the seedy guys you see. James Llewellyn, friend and former roommate of David Ferrie. Boeing Aircraft Company, New Orleans. Melvin Coffee took a trip to Houston and Galveston. Oh, see, he still didn't figure out the Melvin Coffee alias. And this is in 1968. Oh, that's only 2 years after he started his investigation, but still, how the fuck have you not figured out Melvin Coffee didn't go on the trip? And there was no trip. See, this is what frustrates me about, well, I can't really be mad. I mean, the motherfucker figured everything out without Google. Give me a break. Took a trip to Houston and Galveston with David Ferrie, now works at Cape Kennedy. Dante Marancini went to work with the Riley Coffee Company the same week Oswald did. Quit a few weeks later, now works for Chrysler Aerospace Division. Also, Riley Coffee Company is the same company as the Standard Coffee Company. And the Standard Coffee Company also employed William Oswald Jr. and another guy named Julius Oswald, who Julius Oswald, I think, does end up being related to Oswald, but he's like 4 fucking, clicks removed, right? So, but the Riley Coffee Company, a.k.a. Standard Coffee Company, and I believe it's also the Allied Coffee Company, if I'm not mistaken, run by a former CIA guy, employs all these guys who go on to work in aerospace, and employs 3 different Oswalds, all in 1963. Interesting, huh? Can you stop right there just a second? Dante Marancini is an interesting cat. He was born in Bari, Italy. He went to Chicago, returned to Italy, returned to Chicago, then comes down here for some godforsaken reason. He's interesting, and he's cool as a cucumber. And he's also this Italy thing with Shaw and the CMC. What? Dante Marancini was associated with Centro Mondial Comercial? Well, isn't that fascinating? Garrison said he's doing something for an intelligence structure right from the beginning. Incidentally, Marancini, I think most of you know it, is what led us to Shaw, because we got the private detective reports from Shreveport and Nat stakeout reports on David Ferrie, and the car with his license number was visiting Ferrie. And it's Marancini's license number, and looking in the red book, I find Marancini living next door to Shaw and some other people interesting living next door to Shaw. Some of the possibility had come up in other ways, and it began to overload the scale. In other words, this was before we ever heard of Perry Russo. It was too much. For example, Alan Clark, a homosexual who lived in the apartment house next door to Shaw, now works for North American in some operation they have in Texas. Have you ever been contacted by any of their employers, like Marancini? Did Chrysler ever bug you? No. My brother works for Chrysler in Detroit, and I remember at the time you got Marancini in. I went out to see him, and we were talking about the assassination, and he said he's in industrial relations out there in Detroit. And he made some remark about, oh, yeah, we got a lot of feedback from our industrial relations department down in New Orleans on this guy, Marancini, and we're really sweating that one out. He made some remark like this, and I never bothered to follow up on it. I think it was just some kind of gossip sort of thing, don't you imagine? Well, he had a call, or somebody in his department had called their similar department in New Orleans about this guy after his name was in the paper. He's cool as a cucumber. Nothing bothers him. Went to the grand jury. How do you explain the fact that you went to work the same day as Oswald? I don't know. At the Riley Coffee Company. I can find out a little more about that if you want me to. Yeah, I wish you would. What kind of job did he have at the Riley Coffee Company? He's very vague about it. Did he know Oswald? No, I never saw him. In other words, it's like talking, what? It's like a little place in here. It's like that little place, and he didn't know him. The 2 Oswalds there. And he goes, there were 3 Oswalds working there. See, now we're getting to the good stuff. There were 3 Oswalds working there, and not one of them knew the other 2 Oswalds. And so when I subpoenaed the other 2 Oswalds and talked to him, each one was astonished to find out that there were other Oswalds. And then everyone laughs. In one little building. That must be a real friendly bunch over there. Okay, so really what he's saying is all these motherfuckers who work for the CIA are working at Riley Coffee Company. And none of them knew each other. Nobody happened to know anybody. And one newspaper, the Washington Post, actually criticized me for trying to make a production out of the fact that there were 3 Oswalds working there. Laughter. This is one question that nobody ever asked. You know, you'd think it would be worth asking. For all you know, they're liable to say, well, sure, that's my younger brother. What do you want to know? So I talked to some length with the first Oswald who called in, and it was like talking to a wall. Again and again, he said, no, I'll be darned. There are 3 of us. So all you can conclude is that they have been really brainwashed because the other Oswald...
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
From coast to coast, unlock adventure at Red Lion Hotels by Sonesta, where restful sleep, friendly service, and local knowledge await. Whether for business or pleasure, spend less and make more of every trip. When you sign up for the Sonesta Travel Pass, you'll get their best rates instantly. Go to Sonesta.com to book your stay and unlock their best rates with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at Sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.
And you talk extensively to him. I heard there was another Oswald, and I didn't know there were 3 of us. That's like 3 Spakowskis in one rooming house. Another Spakowski, and they laugh again. That's right. The article actually said I was trying to make a production of the fact that there were 3 Oswalds working there. I never met anybody named Oswald in my life. And to have 3 of them in one little place. And they didn't know each other. Particularly, they didn't know Lee Oswald. Did anyone ever check out Lee's aunt? Bill's going to talk to her here in a few minutes. We've already talked to her one time. Cousin, you mean? Lillian Moret. Yeah, she seems to be CIA, and Bill's going to go to try to evaluate her. She may have also been in Atsugi at the same time as Oswald. So this I actually clipped for my book, my document book coming up. And so they're mixing up the names here. And so Lillian Moret's the aunt who works for CIA for sure, but they're really talking about Marilyn Dorothea Moret, who unquestionably worked for the CIA, who traveled to an Air Force base in 1954 that we actually have the documents on now. So, but see, Garrison didn't know that stuff. Thanks to fucking Ancestry.com, right? Motherfuckers uploading shit they don't understand the relevance of, which is amazing. So this is a great thing. Like, so if I have a document about Joe Smith, and my dad was Joe Smith, and I want to put it on Ancestry, and it's a list of people from the military, and then that list just so happens to have a name on it, and that name gets scanned by Ancestry and then attached to that person, right? That's how I found the fucking Lillian Moret flight documents and the Marilyn Dorothea Moret flight documents to Air Force bases in fucking Cuba and Canada and shit. I mean, give me a fucking break. No one ever talks about why Lillian Moret went to motherfucking Cuba in 1955. Why would she have gone to Cuba in 1955? Doesn't make any sense. All right, so Bill's going to talk to her in a few minutes. We already talked to her one time. The cousin, you mean Lillian Moret? Yeah, she seems to be CIA, and Bill's going to evaluate her. She may have also been in Atsugi at the same time as Oswald. Yeah, so when Oswald was working at the CIA base in Japan in Atsugi, Oswald was there at not in Atsugi particularly, but in Japan, in the city of Atsugi. John Pick was right up the road with the Air Force. Marilyn Moret stopped in to visit John Pick in Japan, but allegedly not Oswald. And Richard Case Nagel was out there in Atsugi at the same time in the Marines. So, let me continue. At the time she testified before the Warren Commission, she had spent 3 years traveling in the Orient, Europe, and all over the world. And the lawyer for the Warren Commission said, well, why do you do so much traveling all over the world? And she said, I'm a school teacher. And somebody must have kicked him under the table because he said, "Oh, I see." That's hilarious. Is it cousin or aunt? I think it's a kind of young aunt situation. No. They haven't figured out the relationship here yet. She was 40 years old. Oswald was 30 or 31. She's the one that's the Liebler was dipping with till, isn't she? Yeah, that's right. He went out with her, didn't he? Let me give you a few more of these names, though, so you can see the correlation. This builds up. Gordon Neville formerly worked for Boeing, then went to work for the CIA. He's admitted it, given complete details. Gordon Neville's mother works at Cape Kennedy and used to work for Boeing. Lee Odom, who was in Shaw's notebook and came up, we've just learned he's gone to work for Boeing. Odom in Seattle. No kidding. The two FBI agents came by and bagged his place, shook it down completely just a few days after he left, 3 or 4 days after he left. In Dallas. Is that in Irving? In Irving. How do you know that? The landlady told me. They were keeping track of him to make sure he doesn't get out of line, to make sure he didn't leave anything behind. Garrison says this is where the structure shows because they have to take care of potential witnesses, and sooner or later you find the ties. G. Odom will probably be tying up with Chrisman. That's their intelligence operation up there. Marty Abelow. Odom is such a raunchy character. All of them are. Like it should be Dr. Schweitzer. They picked them so that people will say, well, certainly you can't say the U.S. government is represented. But Odom muffed his lines, though. He dropped the ball, but he could have done us a whole lot of damage. In fact, he did damage on that box number. You see, he destroyed the box number as a piece of evidence. But then he brought Anderson into the picture. Think how this connected Shaw and Oswald together. That 19106. It really did hurt. It really did. But by the time the press got finished with Odom's statement, you had critics like Sylvia Mars saying, what kind of fraud were Garrison trying to perpetrate? But that's the same box number. You can't get around it. Of course, the Mars position as well. These are Cyrillic letters. They've been written over, and what was there to begin with? You look at it with a magnifying glass, and you can see the light writing under the Cyrillic letters. The Cyrillic letters. And the post office box, and it's the same box that Shaw has. I might have to read this like 3 or 4 times to myself because I'm trying to grasp what's happening here. But here's another connection between Chrisman and his operation and Clay Shaw and some kind of shipment with altered addresses on it. They've been written over what was there to begin with. You look at it with a magnifying glass and you can see the light writing under the Cyrillic letters and the post office box, and it's the same box that Shaw has. Let me give this goodie on this. There was Odom that came in to us from one angle. Now, 6 months later, we get approached by this weirdo, James Mace in Miami, that comes to us through Tink Thompson, and he wants to sell us the name of the gun for $25,000. It's a great big deal that Bill Barry was working on. We go down and we find out that he is a deserter from the Army, but the FBI says he's got no record of that. But Barry went up to the FBI with a sergeant on the Miami Police Department. The bureau agent met him at the door, and he had a record this thick, inches thick, Barry describes, on Mace. They can't find Mace, although just after a month after he deserted, he took out a driver's license in his own name in Fort Lauderdale. He's got all the earmarks of a bureau informant. Now, here's some interesting comparisons between Odom and Mace. The point being that we had bought Mace's story, could have damaged us severely. And he was heard on the telephone just before he left saying anything could get him, meaning me. So anything they wanted to. All right, they are both born in Texas. That's not too interesting. They are 2 years apart in age. That's not too interesting. But they both in their Army careers deserted from Fort Campbell in Kentucky. The airborne? Yeah, in other words, that's that desertion racket some agency is using as maybe a lock or maybe a cover. And maybe that cover is set up in Fort Campbell. If you write Fort Campbell, they wouldn't handle it. But they were both deserters from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, as if at various stages of their career. This accounts for them going off on an intelligence assignment. Okay, so, all right, so what Garrison is doing, he's connecting these two guys, Mace and Odom, not Bardwell Odom, who's of the FBI, different Odom. So he's connecting these two guys to an operation that's connected to Fred Chrisman up in Washington State, which is connected to Clay Shaw through this package with an altered address on it down in New Orleans. This is the real meat and potatoes here, ladies and gentlemen. All right, so let me continue on. Both of them tied to the Bureau. The Bureau is cleaning up Odom's place just after he leaves. The Bureau has a file this thick on him but denies it on Mace. How do you spell Mace? Same as Oswald. Oswald deserted from the ranks supposedly, and yet you know he really wasn't. When did he desert? That's why they, in other words, actually he got an honorable discharge, which he carried around in his hand, but that doesn't matter. They revised it to a dishonorable discharge because of his statements in Russia. It's a comparable situation. In other words, the record looks bad for him. He's the same age group, 30 to 32. The disassociation sort of thing. Anyway, to go on with some of these others, you have William Klein, one of the founders of Radio Free Voice of Latin America, out of which Friends of Democratic Cuba was formed. We all know that Friends of Democratic Cuba was used to purchase trucks, equipment for the Bay of Pigs. In one instance, they used Lee Oswald's name. Talking about Bolton Ford. William Klein now works for the Office of Naval Intelligence in Washington. Grady Durham, one of the organizers of Friends of Democratic. Whoa, that's interesting since since the Ted Slag thing is here. Oh, he's talking about Ted Slack. Ooh, Ted Slack. That's a name you never really hear about. Ted Slack I caught on to while I was researching the Tramps because I thought he was a suspect for the short tramp, but he ended up not being one. He was involved in other stuff in this weird right-wing movement. In other words, I think you have one structure involved. You have the power, the military power apparatus of the U.S. government. So you're going to have different intelligence agencies, different armed forces representation. What you really end up with is U.S. government. U.S. government is the sense of that part of the government which is interested in, which is in control and pushing towards Pax Americana and more adventures in Asia. Grady Durham, an organizer of the Friends of Democratic Cuba, now works for the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. Grady Durham does. Yeah, Grady Durham, when he was hired, had been a fugitive from New Orleans since before the assassination because he skipped out with about $35,000. That's what I thought. And now he's working for the government. Yeah, sure. He's in the phone book. Lieutenant Colonel Grady Durham in Washington phone book, and somebody got him money to pay all the complaints back, and they were trying to locate him for ages. We didn't know where he was. Turns out he's working for the government in Washington, D.C. That's not only, don't mind the $35,000 he went south with. Somebody's helping him to pay it off. As a matter of fact, talking about it now, I wrote the FBI and asked them to locate him. You didn't hear back from them, did you? No, I never did. They probably sent him a copy of the letter saying, "Where are you?" I think I wrote the U.S. Attorney General here and asked him to charge Grady Durham with crossing state lines in order to avoid prosecution. Unlawful flight. Yeah, I did that, and we never heard anything. Apparently, they couldn't stand it any longer, so a lawyer representing him from Washington, and they started out payments of complainants, but this guy that the FBI couldn't find was in Washington, D.C., working for the government. What part do you know? I don't know precisely. What's this lieutenant colonel? He was lieutenant colonel in the National Guard, like I am, but the difference is that it will give you an idea of the difference depending on what good graces. Presumably, I was kicked out of the Army, but now he's a lieutenant colonel. In other words, you can't find me in records anymore, and he's in it. Did you find Durham's home address? Yes, he's in the phone book for Washington, D.C. Is it Washington or Virginia? Come to think of it, I don't know precisely. I do know that we had a contact. I can't think of who it was at the moment, but he's been productive help squarely in other areas, as I recall, and he was visiting Gordon Novell several months ago, and Novell greeted him warmly, because he was a friend from New Orleans, a visitor from New Orleans, and Novella just got an envelope through the mail, and he said, "Open it." There's $200 in there. He said, "No, I don't want to open your mail." And Novella insisted on it. It was from McLean, Virginia, and he opened it, and there was $200 bills in there. He said, "I get it every week. This is the secret. This is what makes the thing work." In other words, I think the CIA and this part of the government have discovered that money means more to Americans than anything else in the world, more than their mothers, their wives, or anything else in the world. When they found that out, then they used it. I don't think there's ever been an intelligence agency in history before with economic resources to find this out. They were always seeing the operatives, and the British had to be efficient and account for everything. But here, they've used the money to prostitute ordinary citizens, to change them into people who can't testify to the truth. And where it doesn't work, they kill them. Wild. That is a powerful paragraph by Jim Garrison. And we're going to call it here for today, guys. So make sure you go pick up my audiobook at Buy Me a Coffee for a Warning from History. And my document book should be out in July. I'm shooting for July. It's the middle of May. Should be out by July. I don't see why not. I should be able to finish the thing in the next month or so and get it all nice and tuned up. And yeah, that's all I got going on. Make sure everybody should go subscribe to Bloody History of World War II. I never really talk about it, but I do a whole show on World War II on Substack. It's $5 a month. You guys would really like it. And yeah, that's going to do it for me, guys. I will be back in a couple days. Thank you.
You ever get the feeling the city walls closing in, the concrete jungle suffocating your soul? You crave wide open spaces, the chance to connect with nature, maybe chase some elk, fish a private stream. Well, listen up. There's a whole world out there, and finding your own piece of it just got easier. Head over to land.com. They've got ranches, forest, mountains, you name it. Search by acreage, location, the kind of hunting or fishing you dream of. Land.com. It's where the adventure begins.
Travel smarter, not harder, at America's Best Value Inn by Sonesta, with convenient locations from coast to coast and value-packed comfort at every turn. And when you're a Sonesta Travel Pass member, staying at America's Best Value Inn means earning points toward free nights, upgrades, and more. Go to Sonesta.com to book your stay and unlock their best rates with Sonesta Travel Pass. Here today, roam tomorrow. Join now at Sonesta.com. Terms and conditions apply.